6 years. That's how long it has been since my wife walked out the door. It was early September, 2019. I remember the morning light on the kitchen counter, the silence, the weight in my chest. This wasn't another fight. This was the end. But here's the truth. My marriage had been dead for years before that day. The last time we were intimate was Valentine's Day, 2016. Even then, it felt more like duty than love. For years, we lived as polite roommates, not husband and wife. And yet, I stayed. Through the silence, through the loneliness, through nights when the only words spoken were, "What's for dinner?" I knew it was over. But I stayed. That raises a question every man must face. If you already know the marriage is dead, why do you stay? I've seen this story repeat in the lives of countless men, friends, colleagues, even strangers who've written me. Men convince themselves that staying is easier than leaving. That quiet misery is better than the storm of divorce. But that is a lie. It steals years from your life. It teaches your kids the wrong lessons about love. It convinces you suffering is noble, when it's only fear in disguise. So tonight, I want to walk you through why men stay in dead marriages and why staying is the worst decision you can make. Not just for yourself, but for your wife, and especially for your kids. Picture this. A man in his late 40s, sitting in his living room. The television is on. The dog is asleep. His wife is in the other room, scrolling her phone. They haven't touched in months. They barely speak, except about bills or groceries. When friends visit, they smile. They pour wine. They play the part. But once the door closes, silence rushes back in. That's not marriage. That's theater. And men keep performing night after night. Why? Because we are afraid of the unknown, of the financial hit, of letting our kids down, of starting over. Some of us even wear misery like a badge, as if silent suffering makes us stronger. But suffering is not strength. It is surrender. And the longer you surrender, the more pieces of yourself you lose. If you've ever felt that emptiness, if you've ever looked across the table and realized you're dining with a stranger, stay with me, because what comes next might be the push you need to stop wasting your life. And if you know a man living this story, share this with him. Sometimes it takes another man's honesty to cut through the fog of denial. Staying in a dead marriage does not make you a better man. It only keeps you trapped in the wrong story. And the only way to change the ending is to pick up the pen and begin writing a new chapter. When men stay in dead marriages, the first reason is simple. We avoid pain. It's not courage. It's not loyalty. It's avoidance. I compare it to taxes. If your dividends are reinvested, you don't pay today. You push the bill into the future. That's what men do in marriage. We think, if I don't confront this now, I won't pay today. So we bury the tension. We swallow the anger. We tell ourselves we'll deal with it later. But later never comes. The silence compounds. The cost rises. And we convince ourselves it's noble. We say, I'm protecting the kids. I'm protecting my wife. But that's not protection. It's procrastination. It's like sitting in a house with a leaking roof. Every storm makes the damage worse. One day, the whole ceiling caves in. Avoidance feels safe in the moment, but it's destruction in slow motion. I remember nights staring at the television, telling myself, don't bring it up. Tomorrow will be better. But tomorrow never was. The silence grew heavier, the distance wider, and the pain I thought I avoided was waiting for me. Doubled. From boyhood, we're told, take it like a man. Don't complain. So we carry suffering like armor. But that armor rusts from the inside. It eats you alive. Think of the dentist's chair. The drill is ready. The man says, "Not today. It doesn't hurt that much." So he walks out. For a week he feels fine. But the cavity grows. By the time he returns, the dentist says, "Too late. Now it's a root canal. Now it's 10 times the pain. And 10 times the price." That's marriage avoidance. You think you're escaping pain, but you're multiplying it. Every man who has stayed too long knows this. The short-term discomfort of confrontation is nothing compared to the long-term agony of staying stuck. Here's the truth. Avoidance is not neutral. It's a choice. Every day, you stay silent. You're volunteering for more suffering. You raise your hand and say, "Yes. Hit me again." And the marriage obliges. With loneliness. With resentment. With emptiness. The unknown pain you fear, most of it is imaginary. Yes. Divorce hurts. Yes. It's messy. Yes. It costs. But the suffering of staying in a dead marriage, that's a lifetime sentence. Avoiding pain today is choosing a life of pain tomorrow. And no man wins that bargain. When I was a boy, I hated the dentist. The smell, the bright light, the drills whining in the background. At the Navy clinic, rows of chairs lined the room. Young dentists practicing on kids like me. One of them hurt me so badly I bit his finger. That fear stuck, even as an adult. I avoided appointments. I told myself, it doesn't hurt that much. I'll go next month. But cavities don't heal. They grow worse. What could have been a simple filling became a root canal. What could have cost a few hundred became a few thousand. The pain I thought I'd escaped came back sharper, heavier, impossible to ignore. Marriage works the same way. You tell yourself, we'll deal with it later. Time will fix it. But time doesn't heal what's already dead. It only deepens the rot. I've seen couples wait too long. By the time divorce finally came, the anger was volcanic. The lawyers got richer. The kids paid the price. And any chance of compassion burned away. Waiting does not soften the blow. It hardens it. It poisons the ending. I remember nights at the kitchen table. We hadn't shared a bed in years. And still I told myself, maybe something will change. But nothing changed. Every day added another layer of resentment. Until we were strangers. When she finally left, it was brutal because there was no kindness left. If I'd acted sooner, maybe we could have ended with dignity. Instead, we ended bitter and exhausted. Think of a wound. Clean it early. It heals. Ignore it. Infection sets in. By the time you treat it, the cure is harsher and the scar uglier. That's what waiting does to a dead marriage. It infects everything around it. Men tell me, I'll wait for the kids to grow up. But waiting doesn't protect them. It exposes them. They watch the coldness, the silence. They learn love means endurance without joy. And they carry that script into their own lives. So don't fool yourself. The short-term fear of divorce is nothing compared to the long-term cost of waiting. A dead marriage doesn't heal with time. It only decays. And the longer you wait, the more it will cost. In money, in peace, in dignity, and in years you'll never get back. One of the biggest excuses men use to stay in a dead marriage is money. We say, divorce is too expensive. I can't afford it. But the truth is, you can't afford not to. The longer you stay, the more it costs. In most states, Once you cross the 10-year mark, the law shifts. Spousal support becomes permanent. Retirement accounts are divided differently, and the income you earn in your best years is suddenly part of the calculation. Think about it. At 45, you might earn $100,000. If you divorce now, you split that. Painful. Yes, but manageable. Wait until 55. When you're making 180, maybe 200. Now you're splitting that. Half of a bigger pie. Half of the years you thought you were building for yourself. Would you rather pay half of 100 or half of 200? Let me give you a picture from football. The Dallas Cowboys had a star defender, Micah Parsons. If they had renewed early, the contract might have cost $35 million a year, but they delayed. By the time they acted, the market had shifted. Now it cost $50 million. Same player, a higher price, because they waited. That's marriage. The longer you wait to make the move, the higher the price. I had a friend who stayed for financial reasons. By the time he finally filed, his income had doubled. His house had appreciated, and his retirement account had grown. The divorce cost him hundreds of thousands more than if he had acted years earlier. Waiting didn't save him money. It drained him. And here's what men don't like to hear. Money is replaceable. Time is not. You can rebuild a retirement account. You can work longer. You can earn again. But the years you waste in a loveless marriage, you never get those back. You don't get another shot at 50. You don't get another shot at raising your kids while they're young. You don't get another shot at your health, your energy, your freedom. So stop treating divorce like a financial decision. It's a life decision. Yes, it costs money. But the bigger question is, what is your peace worth? What is your freedom worth? How much would you pay to live again? Because whether you stay or leave, you're still paying. With stress, with lost sleep, with wasted years. Money lost can be earned again. Time lost is gone forever. One of the hardest truths for men to face is this: the woman you married is not the woman you live with today. We cling to an image. The girl we met in college. The smile across the dance floor. The thrill of winning her heart. We tell ourselves, this is the one. This will never change. That memory is powerful. It blinds us. It convinces us the past is still alive. So we hold on not to the marriage as it is, but to the marriage as it was. The problem is, people change. You change. She changes. Life changes. But instead of facing that reality, many men cling harder to nostalgia. We look at old photos, and our minds play tricks. We see a version of her that no longer exists. We filter the past until it looks softer, prettier, better than it ever really was. That nostalgia becomes a trap. It whispers, she can be that girl again. Just wait. But she won't. And deep down, you know it. Because you're not the same man either. I remember one night, looking at our wedding album. Her smile was wide. My eyes were full of belief. I stared at those pictures and thought, what happened to us? But nothing happened. Time happened. We grew older. We grew apart. The girl in the white dress was gone. The man in the tuxedo was gone too. What remained were two people pretending. Pretending the spark was still there. Pretending memories could replace love. And many men live inside that illusion for decades. They replay the highlight reel, hoping the past will return. It never does. This isn't about blame. She didn't fail by changing. Neither did you. That's life. We evolve. We outgrow old versions of ourselves. The mistake is pretending otherwise. The mistake is trying to build a future on a foundation that only exists in memory. Think of high school. You wouldn't try to squeeze back into your old jacket at 45. You've outgrown it. It served its purpose. Then life moved on. Marriage can be the same. Beautiful once, but not meant to last forever. Accepting that she's not that girl anymore hurts. But it also frees you, because the moment you stop fighting reality, you can start asking new questions. Who am I now? What do I need now? What life do I want to build from this point forward? Men, hear me. She is not the girl you married, and no amount of nostalgia will glue the pieces back together. The longer you live in the past, the less future you'll have left. Another reason men stay in dead marriages is this: I'm doing it for the kids. We tell ourselves that keeping the family under one roof is safer than being divided by divorce. But that is a lie. Kids don't just hear what you say. They see how you live. They feel the cold silence in the house. They notice the way you and your wife pass each other like strangers in a hallway. They notice the absence of laughter, the absence of love. You may think you're shielding them, but you're not. You're teaching them. You're teaching them that marriage means pretending, that love means endurance without joy, that silence is normal. I remember when my wife and I sold our house. The realtor told us we were the happiest couple she had ever met. She had no idea it was all an act. We smiled. We held hands. We kissed on cue. Behind closed doors, there was nothing left. If we could fool her, imagine how easily we fooled neighbors, friends, even family. Cookouts, dinners, barbecues. Everyone thought we were solid. But the truth was, we had rehearsed our lines so well, no one could see the cracks. Here's the problem. Your kids aren't casual observers. They live inside the play. They see the show every day. So when you fake a smile, they believe it's real. When you hold hands for appearance, they think it's love. And when they grow up, they repeat what they saw. That's the legacy of staying for the kids. You're not protecting them. You're programming them. Do you want your son to believe a loveless marriage is normal? Do you want your daughter to think silence and distance are what she should expect from a husband? Because that's the lesson. When you stay, and it doesn't stop with the kids, it spreads through the family. Your parents, your in-laws, even your neighbors feel the tension. They may not say a word, but they notice. I'll never forget looking at my kids across the dinner table. They were laughing, talking about their day, and there I was, miles away from their mother. That moment broke me, because I knew this was the model they were learning. If you truly love your children, the bravest thing you can do is leave. Not because it's easy, but because it's the only way to break the cycle. Your kids deserve better than a front row seat to misery. And you deserve better too. A professor once told me, power belongs to the one who sets the agenda. For years, I gave that power away. I let silence set the agenda. I let fear set the agenda. I let routine decide my life. Taking back control begins with a choice. You stop waiting for her to end it. You stop waiting for fate. You decide. And that means saying the words most men are afraid to say, this marriage is over. I'm done pretending. It's time to move on. Those words are heavy, but they are freeing. Because once spoken, the mask is gone, and you are steering your life again. Now, taking control doesn't mean shouting in the kitchen. It doesn't mean listing every wound or grievance. That's not leadership. That's revenge. Real leadership is calm, steady, clear. You speak the way you spoke when you first fell in love, with respect, with compassion. but with truth. You're not asking for permission. You're not debating whether the marriage is alive. You are stating reality, it is dead. And you are choosing to end it. I remember the night I finally said it. My voice shook. My hands were sweating. But when the words left my mouth, I felt relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting. I wasn't avoiding. I wasn't pretending. I had taken back control. And yes, she cried. She screamed. She raged. But eventually, she accepted it. And once she did, she began to imagine her own future without me. That's when healing started, for her and for me. Men think control means dominance. It doesn't. It means responsibility. It means owning your part in the failure. It means saying, I made mistakes too, and now I'm ending this with dignity. That is strength. That is power. When you set the agenda, you stop being a passenger in your own life. You become the driver. And while the road ahead may be painful, at least it is yours. So stop waiting for the perfect time. It will never come. The silence, the distance, the absence of love, those are your signs. Set the agenda. Take back control. Say the words, and start living again. By the time most men finally face divorce, they want to unload everything. Years of anger, years of blame, years of words swallowed. But here's the truth. Bringing it all out will only make things worse. When the judge bangs the gavel, he doesn't care about who forgot an anniversary in 2005. He doesn't care about the 10,000 small wounds. He cares about one thing. Is this marriage over? And if it is, the smartest move is to keep it simple. Don't drag every wound to the table. Don't turn the process into war. Because if you throw mud, she will throw it back. And soon, what could have been a clean break becomes a bloodbath. When I went through it, that was my rule. No laundry list. No long speeches. No desperate attempt to rewrite history. I simply said, this isn't working. It hasn't worked for years. Let's split what we have, 50-50, and move on. To my surprise, that worked. Not perfectly, not without tears, but it kept the process from turning into a war zone because the marriage was already over. There was no point in fighting inside the wreckage. The goal wasn't to win against her. The goal was to reclaim myself. That's what I tell men, say less. The less. Keep it clean. I know how tempting it is to finally let loose everything you've held back. But it won't give you peace. It will only drag you deeper. Peace comes from letting go. From closing the book without rereading every page. From saying, this story is done. I'm ready for the next one. That's what I call Life 2.0. It begins not when the paperwork is filed, but when you choose simplicity over chaos. When you stop digging through rubble and start walking toward light. Yes, she may scream. She may cry. She may fight you for weeks. But eventually, she will see it too. And when she does, both of you can begin to imagine futures apart. Ending a dead marriage isn't about destroying her. It's about saving yourself. It's about showing your children honesty instead of hypocrisy. It's about stepping into the next chapter with dignity, instead of crawling out of wreckage. So keep it simple. Do the hard thing. Do it clean. And claim the freedom to rebuild your life, not as the man you were, but as the man you are now. That is the gift of a new chapter.